Exactly does this mean for you and I? Well, let's take a look at what has been announced and the way forward. Dr. Muller is from the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you very much, Dr. Muller, for availing yourself this afternoon. So according to the Public Enterprises Minister, the country wants some surety that load shedding will be minimized. The reconstituting of this new board, is this the silver bullet that will ensure this?
Well, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, so the easy answer to that is no. I think the reconstitution of the board is a good thing, and I think most commentators and experts would agree on that. There were positions on the board that needed to be filled, but there were also concerns with the functioning of the previous board. So there's definitely a sense in which the management of the company needs to be improved, and the board, the management is accountable to the board, and the board then accountable to the shareholder. So I think this is an important step, but whether it'll yield the required benefits remains to be seen.
We'll speak about the structure of the management, which according to the Public Enterprises Minister, the new board will be responsible in terms of moving things around to ensure efficiency. You've just highlighted a tad bit the challenges that were faced by the previous board. They were operating at a capacity of some 6 people. We'll also get into the technical skills in a few moments, but maybe just a brief reminder in terms of their tenure.
Well, actually what I would first start with is actually talking about the structure of governance of state-owned enterprises in South Africa. There is a sense in which, on the one hand, there were good intentions behind the structure, which applies to all state-owned enterprises. But there's also a sense in which it creates a lot of duplication and it creates problems for accountability. So if you think about expertise, there's been this discussion about needing engineering expertise on the Eskom board. You need engineers in Eskom. You need engineers on the board. You need some people would say you need engineers in the ministry or the relevant shareholder department, so they can also hold the board accountable. And you have all these layers of expertise that are required in a country where actually we know that we have constraints on our expertise one way or another. And so when we have situations also like with the load shedding, with the recurrence of load shedding and moving up to extremely high stages of load shedding, the question then is, who do you hold accountable? Do you hold the power station managers accountable? Do you hold the management of Eskom accountable, the CEO? Do you hold the board accountable? Do you hold the shareholder ministry accountable? Do you hold the president accountable? So there are these problems of accountability that are created by the structure. So unfortunately, the structure is not going to go away because it's in law and it would require a lot to change that. But I think it's important to recognize that the structure itself is actually arguably a problem for accountability. It doesn't seem to have served South Africa very well in the post-1994 period. So there's that big structural problem which is being faced as well.
Sure, and that's something that the Public Enterprises Minister spent a few seconds explaining, that the management is accountable to the board and the board is accountable to the shareholder, and in this instance it's the state. He did also make a comment that there should be hands-off Eskom addressing the tendency to use the power utility as a political football.
Yes, well, that is very important. At the same time, of course, so on the one hand, there is there's political capital that's being made out of load shedding and the failures at Eskom. But on the other hand, that's what political parties do. I don't think one can reasonably expect a political party not to, for example, criticize Eskom or criticize the majority party for what's going on. I think the issue, though, for the broader public is to kind of sift through statements that are maybe more politically motivated based on obtaining political capital and maybe improved results in future elections, and what's actually accurate. So in this particular case, I think there are other interests at play besides just political parties. And I've raised concerns about this in things that I've written in other interviews, which is that there are also vested interests that would like Eskom to go in particular kinds of directions that may not necessarily be the same as the public interest. And I would just like to say in relation to the board, one thing that does concern me is the presence of individuals on the board, and this isn't a personal matter, but who also are board members or working for private sector companies, which in my view have inextricable interests when it comes to energy decisions. That was a concern with the previous board, and there's still some members of the new board who have those kinds of, what I think are actually conflicts of interest that I'm not sure they can extract themselves from. And I do think that an inadequately addressed issue when it comes to energy policy, the performance of Eskom and so forth, is the influence of vested interests, including the big business.
When you say vested interest as opposed to public interest, what are you talking about?
Right. Well, let's take an example of the decentralization of energy generation. Right. On the face of it, it seems like a great idea. Eskom is not managing to produce sufficient capacity for the demand that we have, so we get load shedding. We can put aside the questions as to why Eskom is not managing to do that. So a proposal is, well, why don't we let big companies generate their own energy? Why don't we let municipalities contract from independent power producers? Seems like a great idea. The problem is that that's probably going to have a very negative effect on Eskom's finances, which means it's going to have a very negative effect on public finances, which means the taxpayers are going to have to bail out Eskom either through increased tariffs or through higher taxes, via the national treasury. That kind of costing just hasn't really been put on the table, so government has surged ahead with decentralizing energy generation, which might help with load shedding in a couple of years' time. But it's been driven, the failure to cost that has largely been because the private sector interests have been wanting to do this for themselves. I think they'll benefit in terms of a more reliable electricity supply and reduced tariffs if they're not made to pay higher grid connection fees. So in that case, the private sector interest and the public sector interest don't exactly align. And basically the public sector interest, in my view, the public interest has not been adequately represented in that case. Now, if you work for a big mining company or if you work for a renewable energy company, you sit on the board of a renewable energy company, I don't see how you can take a decision in the public interest, given the interests of the companies that you are working for or otherwise serving.
That's a very interesting point, especially if we go back to your assertion on accountability and the structuring of the board, right? So when we talk about a board, maybe let's just break it down and make it simple. We spoke about whom they account to. In this instance, for the everyday South African that you point out where their interest is not necessarily represented, we might see a couple of years down the line electricity being more expensive for the everyday person. Is this it? What options are then available to South Africans in that matter?
Right. So, as I said, there's this bigger context, policy context, contestation between different interests, which, by the way, is normal. I mean, it's normal in any country. It's normal for any big policy issue. It's not exceptional for the energy issue. But the thing is, the energy issue is perhaps one of the biggest policy issues in South Africa, and will be. The decisions that are taken now will affect, future generations of this country, either for better or for worse. So in that sense, it's really crucial to understand the broader context in which this is happening. One looks at the qualifications of the board members; they look pretty solid. The composition of the board, there were some concerns raised about the presence of engineers. I think the minister to some degree addressed that. There are 5 people on the board with engineering experience. There are people with board experience. There are people with accounting experience and so forth. But the board is kind of in a strange situation in terms of accountability because you don't want a board that's going to micromanage. So the board, in some sense, has to make sure that the right management is in place and that the management is accountable on, say, a more regular basis than they would be to, say, the Minister of Public Enterprises or kind of indirectly to Parliament. So that's what the board is supposed to do. But it's a tricky job. And as I say, it creates these difficulties because if there is failure, it's not entirely clear whether you should be holding the board accountable or the minister or the president. So, we're working within this quite actually imperfect structure, even though it's one that's recommended internationally. I'm not convinced it's a good one for state-owned enterprises. So that's part of the context.
Sure. Very quickly for us, Dr. Muller, I do wonder what you make of this, right? Because we understand that further steps are going to be taken against what the Public Enterprises Minister described as the deliberate climate of resistance in making sure that things work essentially at Eskom. And he says there's active efforts to disrupt operations and suggesting it's some people who even work for Eskom. We've heard a lot about the sabotage. The president yesterday in Parliament talking about a manager that was literally running after a truck of people that were doing corruption, if you will. The president yesterday saying that the current Eskom executive is unearthing corruption, if you will. What should we understand about that dynamic in this entire situation?
Well, I think the one thing that we should say is that the commitment to take action is welcome in the sense that these issues have been alluded to for a long time, but there actually hasn't been a lot of action. And that's a problem for accountability because if a CEO, when there's a power station failure or increased load shedding, if the CEO can blame these sort of vague notion of sabotage or vague notion of resistance then they can never really be held accountable. So if there is such sabotage, then it should be possible to demonstrate that and take action against the individuals involved. The issue of resistance is a little bit trickier, right? Because sometimes you get resistance from employees because maybe management is actually not conducting itself in the right way. So that's a little harder to deal with. And I think the other thing that it hasn't been entirely satisfactorily clarified is the issue of motives, right? There's been allusion to the idea that people aligned to, let's say, state capture interests in Eskom have been sabotaging progress. There's also been an allusion to corruption linked to syndicates, which is kind of more just financial gain driven. And then the other thing is that nobody's mentioned, who really benefits, right? If we're going to allude to motives here, who really benefits? And, I would say that actually the individuals who want to push the breaking up of Eskom and the greater, procurement of other energy sources and so forth are actually likely to be the biggest beneficiaries of higher stage load shedding. And strangely, we've seen individuals in the business press saying things like, maybe South Africa needs a blackout. Maybe that'll focus policymakers' minds and then they'll procure more renewable energy. And there was actually an article recently which quoted the Eskom CEO saying something similar in News 24, and then they changed the headline, right? Because perhaps it didn't land in quite the right way. So, if we're going to talk about motives, then we actually have to seriously talk about who's going to benefit from these things. I think it's certainly plausible that there's employee resistance, happens in a lot of organizations when there's organizational change. It's possible that there's corruption, and it may be possible that there's state capture elements. But all of this is very vague right now. So it's great that the minister said that there's going to be action, because then we can actually assess the extent to which these have indeed been responsible for the deterioration in Eskom's performance, or whether there are other factors at play.
Dr. Shaun Muller is from the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you.